Welcome to our panel, Protecting Whistleblowers from the Espionage Act. My name is Sonia Kennebeck. I'm the director of the new feature documentary, United States versus Reality Winner, which follows the story of whistleblower Reality Winner who disclosed one document about Russian election interference to the media and became the #1 leaked target of the Trump administration. It's world premiering in the competition section of the South by Southwest Festival. And I'm really honored to be moderating today's panel because over the past 2 decades, since 9/11, national security whistleblowers have disclosed some of the most important information about, government misconduct to the public, such as mass surveillance, torture, drone strikes, election interference, but they've never been in more danger of prosecution and long imprisonment, as the case of Reality Winner shows, who received 63 months in prison. She's detained in Texas. We have an excellent panel today, people with extensive government and national security expertise, and I will start by briefly introducing everyone on the panel. I'll start with you, Jesselyn Radack. Jesselyn Radack is a renowned human rights attorney who launched Whisper, the whistleblower and source protection program at Expose Facts, to protect the most controversial and courageous truth tellers in the world. Since 2008, Radeck has been at the forefront of protecting and defending national security and human rights whistleblowers, representing truth tellers like Edward Snowden, Bill Binney, Thomas Drake, who's here, John Kiriakou, and Danielle Hale, who told the public the truth and have been exiled, criminally prosecuted, under the Espionage Act. Previously, she was at the Government Accountability Project, a whistleblower protection organization, and served at the DC Bar Legal Ethics Committee and worked at the Justice Department for 7 years, first as a trial attorney and later as a legal ethics advisor. Jesselyn has testified before the US Congress, European Parliament, Council of Europe, German Bundestag, and she's also an author and a writer and has received numerous awards. Jesselyn Radack actually got into this line of work when she became a whistleblower herself in the first terrorism case after 9/11. And then I'd like to introduce Thomas Drake. Thomas Drake is a former senior executive at the National Security Agency, where he blew the whistle on massive and abuse, the widespread violations of the rights of citizens and the Constitution through secret mass surveillance programs after 9/11 and critical 9/11 intelligence failures. He was a material witness in multiple government investigations, including Congress and the DoD. He also went to the US press in early 2006 with unclassified information disclosed in the public interest. And after a multi-year, multi-million-dollar national security leak investigation involving more than 5 full-time prosecutors and 25 full-time FBI agents, and as retaliation and reprisal, the Obama administration indicted Thomas Drake in 2010 in a signature criminal case as the first whistleblower since Daniel Ellsberg for violating the Espionage Act. Thomas Drake back then was facing 35 years in prison. In 2011, the US government case against him collapsed and he went free in a plea deal. The US Joint DOJ DNI National Insider Threat Task Force labeled Thomas Drake as self-radicalized. I actually would like to, hear from you what exactly that could mean. And he's the recipient of the 2011 Ridenhour Truth-Telling Prize and a joint recipient with Jesselyn Radack of the 2011 Sam Adams Associates Integrity and Intelligence Award. And then I would like to introduce J. William Leonard. Bill Leonard served for 34 years in the federal government as the director of the Information Security Oversight Office from 2002 to 2008. He was responsible for the policy oversight of the executive branch-wide National Security Information Classification System. In the media, this position is often described as Secrecy Czar. Before that appointment, he served in the Department of Defense. Among other positions, he was also the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Security and Information Operations from 2000 till 2002. And in 2002, the president confirmed conferred upon him the rank of meritorious executive. In 2019, he retired as a chief operating officer of the National Endowment for Democracy. And since retiring from the federal government, Mr. Leonard has served as an expert consultant witness for the defense in 3 Espionage Act prosecutions, including for Reality Winner's defense. And the other 2 cases resulted in the only recent Espionage Act prosecutions in which the federal government did not prevail. So Jesselyn, I actually would like to start with you. You're a whistleblower, but also whistleblower attorney. Can you please tell us what is so extraordinary about the Espionage Act? Why are Espionage Act prosecutions so different from other criminal prosecutions?
Well, first of all, this is a law that was from 1917 and is being used to prosecute people for disclosures of classified information. And classified didn't exist as a category until the 1950s. And so that's one problem. Another problem is it's a strict liability law. That means you either disclosed information or you didn't. You cannot raise a public interest defense because your motives, if they were good motives to inform the public about criminal activity, that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter if you blew the whistle, for fame or profit or revenge, or because you're trying to correct a wrong and you're revealing information that's in the public interest to know that the government has often lied about. So this is why, again, resurrecting this law, and it hadn't been used in a long time. There was a big 40, 50, big gap between the Ellsberg case. And then suddenly with Tom Drake, they resurrected this law and thought it would be a good idea. And it's been disastrous for whistleblowers. It makes it like a lot of the proceedings occur in secret. You don't have any kind of defense you can raise until you've already been found guilty. You can only raise your salutary motives and your good motives once you're being sentenced, which assumes you've already been found guilty. So it really ties the hands of defendants of the most basic, being able to talk about their intent, which you can in every other crime, but not with this very serious charge that normally was supposed to go after spies, not whistleblowers. So it just adds insult to injury that people who were trying to tell the truth and divulge information that the public had a right to know are then prosecuted as traitors and spies.
Thank you. And actually, I would like to, lead this over, thanks for giving us the legal background here. Thomas Drake, you actually have been the victim of such an Espionage Act prosecution. I know it has changed your life tremendously. Would you mind sharing some of the personal impact an espionage prosecution had on you?
Well, it completely upends your life. It's not every day someone gets charged under the Espionage Act for non-spy activities, for holding up the mirror to the abuse of power by your own government. It's certainly become the go-to, or the threat, even the threat. People don't realize a number of people who were threatened with the Espionage Act, even if they were not charged or indicted under the Espionage Act. But to say that my life was turned inside out and upside down is a complete understatement. Every social network, every community that you are part of, both professionally and personally, are completely shattered. You are immediately considered to be persona non grata. No one wants to associate with you. Anybody even seen with you is in essence consorting with a criminal. It's an incredibly draconian criminal statute. And part of the irony, of course, is that one of its original bases in 1917 was actually to go after dissent, people that would actually raise questions about what the government's intent was. So it's actually turned into a way, especially starting under Obama, like I was the first whistleblower since Ellsberg charged. under the Espionage Act for non-spy activities. And it's extraordinarily difficult. It's a millstone that you carry, and I carried it for many, many years and was ultimately indicted under it. I had 5 charges against me. It's short of being declared a traitor or having committed treason against the United States. It's probably one of the most serious charges, especially the spy-related part of it. There's literally no defense. And I mean, family, friends, I can't begin to tell you, the financial costs are one thing, because you lose your ability to even have an income. You lose your ability to even pursue a livelihood. Part of the intent of this is to utterly destroy your life. And it's also a way in which it completely separates you from sort of the rest of your common society in which you live. I can't begin to tell you the extraordinary isolation. Although I did not end up in prison, I certainly had moments where I was effectively treated and had to respond psychologically to this. It's even now, when I think about it, the surrealness of being essentially a political prisoner in my own country. And when I say political prisoner, my ability to even navigate locally was extremely restricted. I had to get special permission even before the scheduled trial, and even afterwards during my probation period. I had to get special permission from the government, actually from the from pre-trial probation officers as well as post. But the government had right of first refusal. It was just an extraordinary burden to carry, and it doesn't leave you. I mean, people look my name up, and it's still surreal. People say, "Hey, what the heck happened to you?" There's always going to be an asterisk next to your name, even though I went free, because I was charged under the Espionage Act, and just that label alone makes you someone that a lot of people are going to say, sort of raise their eyebrows and say, you must have done something, because why would the government charge you with such an egregious criminal act? If you violated the Espionage Act, you must have actually threatened the security of the United States of America in some manner that was so out there that you deserve whatever time is necessary to fulfill the crime. But the personal cost, I mean, you'd have to rebuild your life. Your life is shattered, then how do you rebuild it? That's actually one of the huge challenges faced by all whistleblowers, let alone whistleblowers who either are prosecuted or threatened with the Espionage Act.
Thanks for sharing, so honestly what you've been going through. And Bill Leonard, you have an interesting role in this conversation. You work within the government. You were actually in charge of classification, government secrecy. So one might think that you would actually agree with punishing whistleblowers who disclose classified information to the public to the fullest. And yet you even wrote an opinion piece, quite recently in the Washington Post in support of a pardon for Reality Winner. Can you share what motivated you to speak out?
Sure. Obviously, my career speaks to how important I believe the classification system is. The ability to classify information. It denies information to the enemy on the battlefield. It protects sensitive intelligence sources and methods that are crucial to our national security. It allows sensitive diplomatic negotiations to take place in confidence. But for the security classification system to work, it has to be used with precision. And the challenge is that all too often, classification is used indiscriminately within the government. And, so for example, information that could cause damage to national security is a criteria to be classified. But information is not binary. You can't neatly divide information into that which will damage and that which will not. You can make a case that any information could cause some sort of damage to national security. And the Reality Winners case is an instance where, yes, the government could show that perhaps damage to national security did arise. But on the other hand, there was damage to national security that was damage to the nation's interest that was occurring because that information was being withheld. The purpose of intelligence, you don't collect intelligence just for the sake of intelligence. You needed to get it into the hands of those responsible individuals who have the responsibility to actually act, to make decisions. And in Reality Winners' case, that's a perfect example where somehow, some way, the government was collecting this information, but yet it was not getting into the hands of the individuals who actually had to take action in response to this threat. And that is the state and local election officials who were in fact responsible for the security of our election system within this country. So it's an all too, I found it to be an all too frequent occurrence where this where the indiscriminate use of classification can actually, ironically, cause the damage to the national interest that supposedly classification is intended to preclude.
Thank you. You know, a lot of people, you know, might still ask, though, you know, why these whistleblowers are not, you know, kind of going the internal whistleblowing route. You know, I want to ask you, Jesselyn, you know, because you represent so many of the, you know, these high-profile national security whistleblowers. You know, aren't there any other options to disclose, you know, government misconduct, or, you know, what is your experience? Why, you know, do whistleblowers, you know, go public?
Well, I represent national security and intel whistleblowers, and the Whistleblower Protection Act specifically excludes that category of whistleblower from protection. And even other Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act and other measures that have been enacted supposedly to protect that category, they just say that you can blow the whistle, but and that you can't be retaliated against for that. But then when the government does retaliate, there's no enforcement mechanism. There is nothing the whistleblower can do when the government transfers them, terminates them, opens an investigation on them. I mean, there's a whole myriad ways that the government can retaliate against someone, badmouth them to future employers, blacklist them from getting contracts. I mean, a whole enormous array of retaliatory tools the government can use, and there's nothing that the whistleblower can do to stop that. So if you have a right without a remedy, it doesn't do you much use at all. And that's unfortunately the predicament of whistleblowers. And as for those internal channels, in my experience, more often than not, 90% of whistleblowers tried to go through internal channels, and those internal channels not only failed to redress their concern, but they actually turned the complainant into the target, and they ended up going after the whistleblower. So they were too often more of a tool of entrapment to find out who was complaining and who was like airing the dirty laundry than they were to remediate whatever problem was being raised.
Yeah, and I believe one of those cases is actually the case of Thomas Drake. And I know that Edward Snowden has said in the past that he had studied your case, Tom, before he was disclosing information on mass surveillance, and you actually went the internal route. You know, what was your experience?
Well, look, when you're confronted by the reality that your government in secret, and this is the cult of secrecy, where the classification system is so severely abused, it's actually used to cover up crimes and wrongdoing. bureaucratic and administrative embarrassments. And the level at which I was blowing the whistle internally it was up to and including the President of the United States. So I well knew as a senior executive that they were not going to take kindly to any kind of whistleblowing, even though the internal channels existed. That started with my own, immediate supervisor, who was actually the number 3 person at the National Security Agency. That progressed to the Office of General Counsel. That progressed to the Inspector General. But by doing so, you are instantly flagged and tagged. You are now radiating danger to the institution, something that's not often addressed in all this. I ultimately became a material witness in several investigations, including 2 9/11 congressional investigations, asking all the right questions, like what the heck happened? This whole system was put into place, the national security system coming out of World War II, so we would never be surprised again. We would never again have a Pearl Harbor. And so I went through, in this case, it was the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act from 1998, and it turned into an exposure channel. But I knew that. I knew there was one final thing I could do, but I knew that if I decided to go outside of the internal system for all the retaliation reprisal I experienced for blowing the whistle inside the system over multiple years, there was one final thing I could do, and that was go to the press. But going to the press was touching the third rail. The last thing you do when you're buried deep inside a national security agency like I was at NSA, the last thing you're gonna do is go to the press. I mean, my gosh, the government's gonna, especially post 9/11. I was intimately familiar with what had happened to Ellsberg. I knew that by going to the press, even with unclassified information, the government was gonna look at it as a criminal act, even though it was actually just a violation of administrative policy for having unauthorized contact with the press. It wasn't gonna matter to the government. But what was at stake was so huge that I made a fateful decision. That was a choice. I exercised moral agency. This is something very similar to Reality Winner. You're confronted by truth that's actually being protected by the secrecy system, the classification system, knowing that if you go outside of that, it is a violation. It's a violation of a lot of executive orders, the executive classification system. And that by doing so, that you're going to draw attention to yourself. And so all those channels, right? But I couldn't remain silent. I mean, this is one of the things that is ultimately sort of the conundrum faced by whistleblowers, is you're faced with a choice. You can remain silent, or you can be silent and stay complicit, meaning if I remain silent, then I would essentially be acknowledging that what I was aware of, sort of the dirty knowledge of government wrongdoing and extraordinarily high violations of the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, extraordinary sweep of domestic surveillance programs in which I became an eyewitness. Well, then, yeah, if you share that with sort of the wrong people, never mind the press, but you share with the wrong people, because the government is actively covering up and it's a super deep state secret, they're not going to take too kindly to the exposure. But I couldn't remain silent. And part of the challenge, I mean, this is sort of you're in the woods, right? But you're in a secret woods, and the woods have walls, and the woods have guards. So anybody going outside the system, even within the system, meaning you go outside your immediate agency, is already going to be tagged as a troublemaker, as someone who's spilling the beans, as it were. And they simply don't take too kindly to that. I can't begin to tell you what it even took to protect me. As many attempts as Congress did during their investigations to protect me, there was no protections. There was all kinds of internal surveillance going on to make sure that anything that was being shared outside of NSA would know about it ahead of time or during the process. No matter what extraordinary means were actually used to protect me, in terms of the actual right I had to go to Congress to expose wrongdoing and violations of the Constitution by my own agency. So yeah, these are not easy choices. And the other thing I'll just share very quickly, you don't wake up one morning. It's really important. I mean, I think it really applies to Reality Winner. You don't literally wake up one morning and say, hey, I'm looking forward to becoming a whistleblower today. Like somehow that becomes the thing that turns you. That is not the case at all. The vast majority of whistleblowers are actually rule followers. They're the last people that would violate any of the internal rules and all of the restrictions that are put into place for all the reasons even Bill Leonard mentioned. And yet here you are confronted by stark truth that is being protected from the American public and is not actually being provided to those who can make a difference in the defense of our nation.
You raised so many important issues, Tom, that also affect me as an investigative journalist, who works with whistleblowers. The mass surveillance, the opportunities that we have now, or the government has now to get surveil journalists and employees and so on, is really making our work a lot harder as journalists, and on the other hand, is creating this substantial threat. And I really want to also raise awareness here that national security whistleblowers in particular are quite a rare breed. People, maybe it's because of Hollywood and the media and so on, they might think that whistleblowers are common, but in fact they're actually not. And it takes tremendous courage and sacrifice, as we have seen, to speak out and disclose information. I think it's very important what you were just saying, Tom. I think no one actually does this lightly. I believe most people, from what I've seen and what I've heard from whistleblowers, are quite aware of the consequences. And yeah, it's really impacting our democracy, and that's why Bill, we've had conversations about your role in really kind of supporting whistleblowers so strongly. And one of the things that we've discussed and would have I have witnessed as well is that there are some people like General Petraeus who disclose secret information and are not charged under the Espionage Act. For a general audience, why could you maybe explain from your viewpoint how there can be such different treatment under the law? Do you actually also know more examples?
No, you're absolutely correct, Sonia. And again, that was another reason why I agreed to become involved in Reality's defense, because I just saw it as a grotesque example of government overreach for that very reason. It was Jim Comey himself who talked about in conversations with then President Trump of the need to have a head on the pike in order to deter leakers. And of course, we only learned of that quote after Comey's own notes were leaked to the press. But it's an example where justice is not being served. When you start using individuals as examples, as opposed to dealing with the specifics of the individual and the specifics of the incident itself, you're using the criminal prosecution process for a means other than just to achieve justice. But you're absolutely right. I mean, in the Petraeus example, there was an example of Sandy Berger, former national security advisor to President Clinton, who secreted information, highly classified information, in his socks and removed it from the National Archives building. And ironically, when he was removing that from his sock, he was actually standing right below my window of my office. And if I had looked out the window at that time, I could have seen the former national security advisor removing a top secret document illegally. And yet he got off with a slap on the wrist as well. And even more troubling.
Can you share what he did with that document?
He ended up supposedly burning it in his fireplace. He was preparing to give some testimony to Congress, and he didn't want to be troubled with dealing with all the government's protocols in terms of properly handling that information. And he wanted to take it to his home, and he could review it at his leisure. And allegedly, he burned it in his fireplace is what he ended up doing with it. But it goes to a larger problem with the whole system in terms of how it is dysfunctional. The executive order that sets forth the authority to classify information, that's what provides for sanctions. However, when it talks about sanctions, it not only talks about sanctions for individuals who improperly disclose classified information, it also talks about sanctions for individuals who improperly classify information in the first place. And it doesn't draw a distinction between those two offenses. And it makes reference to administrative sanctions, criminal sanctions, and what have you. And of course, we all know of countless individuals who have been sanctioned for supposedly improperly handling or disclosing information. Many have been sent to prison. And I like to point out that the number of individuals who have been sanctioned for improperly classifying information in the first place, that number is also countless. But the reason why it's countless is because the answer is zero. No one has ever been sanctioned for improperly classifying information in the first place. And yet you ask any senior official, the most conservative, Don Rumsfeld, my former boss at the Pentagon, he himself would say the government classifies too much information, overclassification and what have you. But yet the system does not sanction anyone for ever doing that. And that one fact just highlights how dysfunctional the process, in fact, continues to be.
Yeah, and I actually have a quick follow-up question to what you were saying with the classification in regards to Reality Winner's disclosure about foreign election interference, because it seemed that, and you wrote about in your op-ed as well, that as part of the Mueller investigation, very similar information was released to the public, and that was in Reality Winner's 5-page document that was made public. And so as a normal person, citizen, you wonder how can that information be publicly revealed, and at the same time another person, a young person, is currently still in prison for releasing the same type of information. And at this point, when the information is out, shouldn't she come out of prison? What are your thoughts on that, Bill?
No, I mean, you're absolutely right, Sonia. I mean, the Mueller disclosure is an excellent example where the government belatedly came to the conclusion that it was in the national interest that the public be made aware of that information. Unfortunately, it was a little too late for the responsible individuals, the state and local officials who are actually responsible for securing the election systems in 2016. It was a little too late for them, but nonetheless, the government did come to the conclusion that whatever so-called damage would occur by its disclosure, the public interest far outweighed that.
And Jesselyn, you are currently representing another whistleblower, Danielle Hale, who is facing 50 years in prison under the Espionage Act. He was also portrayed in my film National Bird about the US drone war. Can you please tell us about his case, in general, and give us an update?
Daniel's case, search warrants were executed at Daniel's residence back in 2014. At the time, recently, me, Abby Lowell, other attorneys who worked on the case thought it was dead on the vine. There was zero activity since 2014. And then suddenly Jeff Sessions decides, I'm going to dust off all these moldy oldie leak cases because we're going to be tough on leaks to appease Trump, who himself is a leaker. And so they resurrect this old case and charge Danielle Hale. Meanwhile, his disclosures clearly are in the public interest. They have been the subject of an award-winning book by Jeremy Scahill, multiple documentaries, including yours, which has won awards. The public information that we know about drones is in large part due to Daniel's disclosures, but he is facing a very stiff penalty. And again, it's about example making. Clearly, I mean, there doesn't seem to be any harm that's been asserted other than embarrassment about improper targeting, overbroad targeting, and problems in the drone program, including after action reports and targeting civilians, whoops, and other mistakes that were made. And I think a common theme with the people who are getting prosecuted, whether it's Chelsea Manning or Tom Drake or Reality Winner, is that the information they revealed embarrassed the government. And in Reality's case, contradicted the Trump's main party line, which was Russia didn't try to interfere with the election. Russia didn't interfere. And ultimately, she contradicted the president of the United States. That's the undercurrent behind what's going on in Reality Winner's case and why she was punished so harshly, and Trump trying to appease people by getting tough on whistleblowers. Tom Drake, they made an example of him, and I think Reality Winners, I thought Tom's was the most egregious case I'd seen, but now Reality Winner, unfortunately, has that mantle. And I think in the end, she will be utterly vindicated by history, thanks to conversations like this and films like yours. And, history will be the ultimate arbiter, and she will come out well in history. But she has paid an incredibly steep price for basically revealing truthful information that was in the public interest to know.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to note, again, that, she is currently in prison right now. She received the longest sentence a whistleblower ever was imposed in a federal court. And we know from her family, how much she has been suffering in prison. Then we have, Edward Snowden, who is in exile in Russia still, and is also, having a very, very difficult time. And Chelsea Manning, Tom Drake, John Kiriakou, all of them have, and Danielle Hale are going through still till this day through a lot of trauma. And that's why, we're putting on this panel here, because people are actively suffering for disclosing information to the public, to journalists, who, information that is being used and repeated over and over again. And, in a very, very strong public interest. I personally, I became a journalist because I wanted to, uncover government misconduct and inform the public, and be educational. And we've seen throughout history how, these type of investigative journalists, Watergate scandal and so on, are, being celebrated, in the past, the ones of the past, but they have such, these disclosures have such a place in history, and they're strengthening our democracy. What we're seeing now is a tremendous, threat to our jobs, because we are risking, the safety of our sources, our own safety, but it has implications, I believe, for every citizen, because you are all deprived of crucial information that helps you vote, helps you make decisions, and live a good life. So I would really like to hear from all of you, where can we go from here? We've seen the situation is tremendously bad right now, and it has a great chilling effect, not just for whistleblowers but also for journalists. What are your suggestions? What we can do to make things better? And maybe Tom, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll just summarize, because there's a whole lot that I've actually had to ponder over the intervening 10, 11 years, and even going back even further to 9/11. What's really happened to us since 9/11. There's sort of the before 9/11 and after 9/11. And I think one of the things that is unfortunately still in play that has still not been tackled head on is the sanctity of national security taking primacy over rule of law in the Constitution. This is often forgotten in the myriad of sort of the politicalization of the various parties on the spectrum, even in the social media and in the press. Sort of you're always having to do the both sides-ism thing. And national security is the thing that seems to keep prevailing, that there's this deference, this extraordinary deference paid to the point where even Congress is largely co-opted by it because of the secrecy system. I mean, the very system that was put into place to protect against corruption of secrecy because of all the scandals that came out of the 1970s has now been flipped upside down. And so that's like, to me, is really crucial, because it's like the Constitution doesn't matter anymore. And I took an oath, right? These oaths matter. The president takes a very special oath that's actually stated in the Constitution. That's the first thing. The other thing is there are differences already made. I just want to share this. I think this is often lost in the reality winner case. One of the extraordinary, and it's an ironic paradox, I'm going to use that phrase, an ironical paradox, that reality winner's choice, the exercising moral agency in the moment to reveal something that was kept secret, that actually a critical interference with the very election infrastructure actually created the conditions for a far more secure election than otherwise would have happened. I mean, in many respects, she was the trigger. She was a trigger because a secret kept from the American public became public. So one of the things that's lost in this, forget the person, as much as we pay an incredible price for it, and I believe, Jesselyn, you're correct, that we are ultimately vindicated. What she actually set in motion, multiple election officials cited the actual press reporting that came just from her alleged disclosure alone to that particular news outlet. This was confirmed in the Mueller investigation, and then in the Senate investigation that where the Republicans held the majority. Another thing, I agree with Bill Leonard. And this is and I'm channeling Jess here, a right without the remedy, but even in the executive order that governs all this, you can't use the classification system to hide violations of the law, wrongdoing, administrative embarrassment, and other issues related to that. Meaning, I'm going to use the classification system to do unlawful, illegal activity, but if I'm ever called on the carpet for it by a whistleblower, it's protected by the classification system. And worse, you, me, whistleblower, and I'll just say whistleblower at large, sort of the royal we whistleblowers, you now have committed a crime because you're calling out state crime. So it's a crime against the state to actually expose crimes of state. It's just, and so we're at a nexus point. I really think we're at a nexus point. We are not just whistleblowers, we're also canaries in the coal mines of democracy, whether it's buried deep because that's where a lot of what's happening underground is occurring. Again, the secrecy system, as well as that when it bubbles out and bursts into the open and it's out where people can see it. But we're the ones, it's the warning system. The warning system says, this is not good for who we are as citizens. This is not good for who we are in terms of our rights and our privacies and our liberties. And yet we're the ones that are made the examples of. We're the ones that are sacrificed on the altar of national security. And so the policy choices that are made in Congress, because that's where laws are born and where laws or legislation is born, it turns into laws, and where legislation also dies, unfortunately, in most cases in the Senate. It's really crucial to begin shifting the conversation to what kind of future do we really want to keep? Do we want to continue with the grand experiment with all of its faults and foibles that was launched over 230 years ago? Do we really want to or not? Because ultimately it comes back to we the people.
Can I pick up on what Tom said?
Yeah.
Basically, Tom is right. There needs to be legislative fixes. Number one, I would repeal the Espionage Act. Short of repealing the Espionage Act, if that can't happen, I would add a public interest defense. And people have tried to do that and are continuing, even in this current cycle, trying to add a public interest defense, which always gets a lot of resistance.
Could you explain that a little bit more? Like, what is a public interest defense?
A public interest defense would allow a whistleblower to say why they blew the whistle. Because right now, it doesn't matter whether you disclosed information because you were trying to profit or get a movie deal or support some pet cause, or if you're disclosing it because, like the most significant disclosures we've had, it reveals torture, war crimes, secret surveillance, election interference, and some of the biggest scandals of the past century. And that distinction is important. So efforts to repeal it so that you could talk about motive in why someone disclosed information. Right now, it's like, did you or didn't you? And it doesn't matter what your motives were. So that's incredibly important. But I mean, again, the Espionage Act is a very antiquated law, and we can tinker around and try to do legislative fixes to the Espionage Act. But I mean, there are 18 other laws out there that can be used to go after improper disclosures of classified information. And it wouldn't be a huge loss if we just completely got rid of the Espionage Act, which has been so abused in recent history. And then my other legislative fix would be to expand whistleblower protection to cover national security and intelligence employees and give them greater coverage than they have, and to give meaningful protection by allowing enforcement mechanisms. It sounds great to have pretty words saying you can't discriminate or retaliate against a whistleblower. When the government retaliates against you in spades, there's nothing you can do. And that needs to change. So those would be my two main legislative fixes. And then I would also amend the Computer Fraud Abuse Act, which is often used in tandem with the Espionage Act, to go after whistleblowers. I always said the war on whistleblowers was a backdoor war on journalists, and we're seeing that more and more, and even on publishers.
Exactly. I wanted to actually follow up on that because, we are talking about whistleblowers, specifically here on this panel, but the Espionage Act has been used against publishers like Julian Assange. So repealing that act would have implications for that case as well, right, Jesselyn?
Absolutely. And I get Assange is controversial and he is not popular right now. But that's precisely why they're making him the first test case, because I mean, the government's, he's not a publisher. Okay, but the stuff that he's being charged with is for publication activity and normal stuff that journalists do all the time, like developing a source, communicating electronically with that source using secure encrypted technology to do so. This is something that routine journalistic activity that journalists, and I would argue good journalists, engage in. So, I mean, I think Assange, because of his unpopularity right now, is kind of the low-hanging fruit that they can test drive this theory on. But the implications, anyone who reported on Assange's information, which is basically every major publication in this country, they would also be just as guilty. The Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, it would be just as vulnerable. Also, it would make all of our journalists who are foreign correspondents vulnerable to being arrested for violating the secrecy laws of other countries in which they're doing work. I mean, the implications on both sides are so scary that we need to try to not caricature Julian Assange and not be like, well, he's not a real journalist because of this and that. These are distinctions without a difference when it comes to creating terrible precedent that will be used against more mainstream media in the future. And it's completely contrary to a free and open democratic society. And, there was editorial pushback at one point, when Assange was first indicted, but that could be occurring at a much higher volume. And instead, everyone's busy being like, well, we're different from WikiLeaks because we X, Y, and Z. And that's very short-sighted, in my opinion.
Thanks, Jesselyn. And you mentioned one thing, that there are plenty of other laws. I don't know if you can go into that a little bit, Bill, or, like that's one of the things, like mishandling classified information. Are there, from your experience, if the Espionage Act would be repealed, would there still be other possibilities to, like other laws to use?
Yes, there are. And actually, though, I would like to make one point to build on Tom's point in terms of deference, because that's something I think Congress can also do as well, is the value of independent review of assertions by the executive branch of classification has been clearly demonstrated. There's such a thing as the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel, which President Clinton established, still exists. And basically, it reviews denials of access to classified information by researchers, journalists, members of the public. It reviews decisions made by agency heads that says, no, you can't have this information because it's still classified. This panel, established by the executive order, since the time of President Clinton, 75% of the time, it overrules an agency's assertion that this information still meets the criteria for continued classification, 75% of the time. And so that just highlights the value of independent review. And the challenge is, as Tom pointed out, not only Congress, but the judiciary gives undue deference to executive branch assertions that, no, this information is classified and sensitive. And therefore, I believe that if Congress was to establish a means by which there is independent review, for example, there is a congressionally established public interest declassification board that has appointees by members of Congress and by the president. If such an entity had been given this authority to do an independent review on behalf of Congress, on behalf of the courts, I think that would go a long way to curtailing government abuse of using classification to punish whistleblowers or others when actually the instance has nothing to do with damage to national security.
Thank you, Bill. We actually are at the end of our time. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge on this important subject that's very close to my heart. Whoever's watching, please look out for our film United States versus Reality Winner. We're going into the history of the Espionage Act, but also very much into her specific case. She is in prison right now, and there's an active, her family has a clemency petition going on. Ed Snowden is in Moscow. So let's really think about the implications of this law for our society and democracy. Thank you very much. And I see you all soon. Bye.
Thank you.